everybody? You are with Strong Inspirations. Man, today is Dr. King's celebration birthday, January 18th, 2021 in America, as we celebrate the life of one of I would say our foremost civil rights leaders. And so on this channel, I do my best to find people who know the information firsthand. I got a gentleman that's going to tell us firsthand his recollection of Dr. King. I want you to subscribe to the channel, hit the subscribe button. I want you to like the video, hit the notifications button, tell other people about Strong Inspirations. You know about my book, Black Business Book. It's on Amazon and then my film, Business in the Black. They're both on Amazon and they're on my website, businessintheblack.net. But without further ado, I got a gentleman, I'm telling you, oh my God, it's unbelievable. He agreed to do it with me. He is elevating us. I want to introduce Dr. Robert Greene, a professor. I'm gonna let him tell his story. Dr. Greene, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan, drafted in the military in 1956 or 58, 56, I guess, getting old. And after my military time, I ended up living in San Francisco, but also went back to Michigan and went to Michigan State and finished up my education. I did my bachelor's and master's at San Francisco State, and I did my PhD at Michigan State. So I guess in a way, Michigan is my home. And that's where I, have my best memories of Martin Luther King Jr. because Martin Luther King Jr. made 2 trips to Michigan State at my invitation years ago. And that's how we really became close enough for him to say, Bob Greene, I want you to come work for me. And I took a leave from the university. I was married by then, had 3 little boys. And we moved to Atlanta and I worked for Martin Luther King Jr.
How did you invite him to come to the university? How did you get to him?
Well, when I met him in San Francisco, he gave the keynote address to the NAACP at the National Convention. I believe that was in 1955. I was so impressed that I said, Dr. King, after the speech, I worked my way through the crowd. I remember it very well because the keynote person after him was a lady by the name of Mahalia Jackson. Okay. And she was supposed to sing, but she couldn't sing because she had a sore throat. So I was behind her, but I reached around her and I pulled his coattail and he turned around and he said, hello. I said, Dr. King, my name is Robert Greene. And one day I would like to work for you. He said, well, what do you do? And I told him at the time I was driving a yellow cab in San Francisco. I was a taxi driver.
Really?
Probably about 25 years of age.
Okay.
He said, well, tell you what, when you finish your education, come see me. I'd love to have you work with me. But he said, in the meantime, in 2 weeks, I'm speaking at a brunch over in Berkeley, California, to Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, and I'm going to invite you to that. I went there, met him a second time. Long story short, I stayed in school, finished up my doctorate, had a wife and 3 little boys, and the rest is history. I've celebrated him ever since. And I want to say just one thing, because I don't want to miss this. People often ask me, what did I really learn from Martin Luther King Jr.? And I always pick this out. There was always a lot of fear in the Black community about rights, about racial discrimination, especially Blacks who grew up and were raised in the South, like my dad in Georgia. And I always thought my dad was kind of a fearful man, and he finally admitted it. He said, I was fearful that maybe one day you might be arrested by the police. I was fearful that you might go to jail. And my dad pushed that. He always said, I want my 3 sons to stay in school, stay out of trouble, and don't go to jail because I don't want to lose you. And Martin Luther King Jr. taught us how to deal with the very objectives that my dad had in life. So yes, I met him when I was 25 years of age, or 26. I had finished my PhD, and I was on the faculty at Michigan State. And the students wanted to have a speaker there to help them raise money so they could go to Rust College the summer of '66, I think it was, and work at Rust College for civil rights. So I didn't have the money. I didn't know how to get the money, but I thought of maybe having King up to give a speech, and we raised some money. Did just that. I found a way to meet him through a follow-up meeting with him. He came to Michigan State and spoke about social justice and overcoming fear. Right. Tremendous speech.
Right.
And when it was over, he said, you know, Brother Green, you need to come work with me. You here in this pleasant, calm, polite university, come work with me. And so I asked president of the university, President John Hanna, to give me a leave. He did. And I went to work for Martin Luther King Jr. And that was the best decision I ever made in my life.
Now, let me ask you, how did you invite him to come to university? Was there a telephone number? Was he at SCLC?
No, there was no telephone number that I had. But let me tell you what I did. I had met a young lady at San Francisco State College who left San Francisco State and went to work for Dr. King in Atlanta, and I knew that.
Okay.
I tracked her down, and she put me in touch with him.
Okay.
And like you say, in those days, it was a lot easier to reach people than it is today.
Oh,
you know,
really?
I didn't have to go through 15 people to meet. I just called and said, I'd like to speak to Martin Luther King Jr. And I said, my name is Robert Green, and he asked me to call him. I put it like that. Right. And they put him on the phone.
Really?
Yeah, and of course that was in 1954, was it? 54, 56 was occurred. I got my helper over here who helped. Sure. Look, man.
60 or the 64, 65. 65, 66.
65, 66, I went to work for Martin Luther King Jr.
Now so you called down there. Now this is after he had done the March on Washington and
no,
yes.
No, my son says yes.
March on Washington before you met him. Or before
yeah,
you worked with him.
Yeah, okay, all right. I guess the March on Washington had occurred. As a matter of fact, let me tell you why I know it had occurred. I had been in a place called Farmville, Virginia, a little small town where there was racial discrimination against Blacks, and Blacks were treated in a very mean and brutal way. I was in Farmville and came back to Michigan State. I had to teach a class, and I was scheduled to teach a class, but I couldn't do that because I wanted to hear Martin Luther King Jr. speak. Well, to make a long story short, I still didn't get time off to hear him speak. So I missed that famous speech. I have a dream speech. And that was because I ended up there in Virginia.
Okay. Did you see him do the speech in Detroit?
No, actually, I told someone he gave that speech 3 times. He gave it in Alabama first. And I missed, no, I'm sorry. He gave this I Have a Dream speech basically in Detroit first.
Right.
Then he gave it in Alabama, and I missed that. When he gave it in Washington, D.C., I had to teach that day at Michigan State, and I had taken so much time off to work with him that I missed that one too. So I never personally, as much as I traveled with him, as many times as I heard him speak, I missed probably the most famous speech he ever gave.
Right, right. Now, was he a tall guy? Was he
No.
a burly guy? I mean, he doesn't look like it in his pictures. Was he a funny guy?
He was a small guy with a good attitude towards people. And I'm going to tell you something about Martin Luther King Jr. He was a tremendous swimmer and runner. And I recall one time he challenged Andy Young, who was his top lieutenant, to a swim, the length of an Olympic swimming pool, size swimming pool. He not only beat Andy, but he left him behind by quite a bit. And we all thought that was very funny.
Yeah.
King was a good athlete. He had a good sense of humor, you know, even in the face of death, left him.
Really?
So he said, okay, and he said, we're gonna run. Let's run a 100-yard dash. So all of us gathered around, myself, Hosea Williams, and others gathered around, and somebody blew the whistle. When the whistle blew, King looked at Andy and said, okay. And Andy said, okay, and King was gone.
Wow.
So he had a good sense of humor.
Wow.
He was a person that respected individuals. The one thing I want to say, Brother Anthony, that there was always a lot of fear in the African-American community about getting in trouble. I mentioned that earlier.
Yeah.
Not doing the right thing, ended up in jail. And my dad was a product of the South. So he was always kind of a fearful man. And I learned through Martin Luther King Jr., there's no need to be afraid. So if you're fighting for social justice and fighting for the right thing. So when I reflect on Martin Luther King Jr. and people ask me, well, what do you remember most about him?
Right.
I say, I remember the fact that he taught Black people not to be fearful,
Right.
not to be afraid, no matter what.
Right.
Now, one point, some of that fear was based in reality.
Sure.
My dad was always kind of a fearful man, Brother Anthony, and I never knew why.
Yeah.
I found out one day why my dad was so fearful of white people, especially. My father, when he was 14 years of age, saw his best friend lynched, hung from a tree.
Ooh.
In Jones County, Georgia, Haddock Station, Jones County, Georgia. And he never got over that.
I'm sure.
And as I said before, I asked him, well, what happened? Why did he get lynched? He said, my best friend was lynched because he did not get out of the path of a white man fast enough. And they thought he was uppity. Wow. So that's how fear was instilled in the Black community. And Martin Luther King Jr. used to say, don't be afraid.
Wow.
When you fight for social justice, fight for truth, fight for reality, and you will be okay. So and I respect King for that.
When you went to work for him, you were at Michigan State, so you moved to Atlanta?
Yes, sir. I moved to Atlanta with my wife and 3 sons.
Now, where was he at? Where was he at? Was he at the church or he was at SCLC? Where was you working at?
Well, he had a joint appointment. He was at SCLC and he was also a pastor there at Ebenezer. And the reason I remember Ebenezer so well, and I'll come back to the church, Ebenezer so well, the first anti-war sermon I ever heard was at Ebenezer, in which Martin Luther King Jr. preached about discrimination in Vietnam and why we should not be in that war.
Okay.
So So
now, where was your office at?
Where was his office?
Where was your office at when you worked for him?
I had an office at SCLC over there on Auburn Avenue, was it? Yeah. I had an office over at 334 Auburn Avenue.
Now, where was his office at?
The office. And that's where I really developed a respect for women in the movement. And I want to say that for a second. Too often the movement was led by men, powered by men. But I met women like one, Coretta Scott King, Dr. King's wife. I met Fannie Lou Hamer, people like that. Fannie Lou Hamer, who was a powerhouse in the civil rights movement.
Sure.
So Dorothy Cotton,
Sure.
among others who traveled with Dr. King. So there was a lot I learned from women in the movement. And I'm working on a piece now on women in the movement and social justice. And I'm going to show you a copy of my book here on social justice
Sure.
that I'm promoting a little bit.
I see it.
But
No, we
anyway,
gonna get did you were you scared that people might want to mess with you to get to him?
I was, fearful of what might happen to Martin Luther King Jr. I never was really fearful about myself. Martin Luther, but King was interesting. He taught us to not be afraid. He said, as long as you're fearful, you're never going to be able to overcome discrimination. You're not going to be able to fight for freedom if you're fearful. So King was not fearful. And I think he was kind of a role model for a lot of us.
Did he
because,
make
in places like Mississippi, you knew that if you challenged whites and something happened to you, there was no redress.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it happened and that was it. Now, of course, a lot of that changed over the years, but that's what it was like during my day and time in Mississippi. And Mississippi we saw as a very mean, brutal place. And the thing that just blows my mind is that a lot of those communities where whites were so mean and hateful, you now have blacks, good blacks, in leadership roles.
Yeah, right.
Like Grenada, Mississippi.
Yeah, exactly.
Suggs Ingram was the white sheriff in Grenada, Mississippi that everybody was afraid of.
Yeah.
Suggs has been dead now about 4 years.
Yeah,
but there's a young black guy in Grenada who's the mayor.
Yeah, sure.
And same thing, I think, in one of that big Alabama town. I don't know, the Birmingham or Montgomery, not Selma. Selma does have a black mayor, but had a black mayor. Yeah. And that allowed us to feel that maybe the days and time we spent fighting for social justice is really beginning to have a payoff.
Yeah. Did you, what did you do for him? What was your job?
I was the education director, and we conducted, when I say we, I mean myself, Septima Clark, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Dorothy Cotton. We ran workshops. We would bring people in from Alabama, blacks, Mississippi, and train them on how to pursue social justice in such a way that they would not be hurt. Okay. We taught them how to file complaints when they were discriminated against, knowing very well that even though their complaints into the Justice Department would not be acted upon, we will still try to pursue justice in the proper way. So I was the education director. I also ran literacy programs, teaching blacks how to read and write. And many could read and write in a very strong way. But that was the thing that people in a leadership role who are white, you can't vote because you can't read.
Right.
You can't vote because you can't count.
Right.
And so we made sure that we would do what we could in a meaningful way to overcome those obstacles, even though the obstacles were artificial.
Did you travel with him any to the places he went, or did you do any of the marches with him, that kind of thing?
Many marches. Primarily, I spent the summer of '66 in Mississippi. And Martin Luther King Jr. put me in charge of the Meredith March. That was the march against fear. Meredith was denied admission to the Ole Miss, the university.
Yeah. And
he decided to demonstrate and show that he was not afraid. When he started marching through Mississippi, he was shot, but not killed. And that led to large groups of blacks coming in and some white supporters coming in from all over the country, supporting what we call the March Against Fear. It was the James Meredith March.
Wow.
And
so you were the man in the front row in the middle of that march.
The man in the front row in the middle of the march, I think, is behind me. I think was Hosea Williams and John Lewis.
Okay.
I participated in the March Against Fear because after the incident on the bridge, the Selma Bridge incident, Martin Luther Jr. sent out a call for people to come in from all over the country. So I came in that next day. I can remember it well. It was the day after the Selma March. I ended up working in Alabama for a while for social justice.
Wow. And unbelievable. And just happened to run into him, tell him you want to do it. And what, 10 years later, 15 years later, it came true.
It came to probably 20 years later. Martin Luther King Jr. Was one of the strongest, most decent persons I ever met. When I wrote this book, At the Crossroads of Fear and Freedom, I had Martin Luther King Jr. in mind because he was the person who taught all of us. You know, when you see people today who argue that I'm not afraid of anything, I said, good. But there was a time when we were all afraid. We were afraid for our lives. We were afraid for our families. We were afraid for our children. But Martin Luther King Jr. said, fear not, fear none of that. Be strong, worship the Lord, and fight for freedom.
Were you a sharp dresser like he was?
No. Well, when you get a copy of my book, At the Crossroads of Fear and Freedom, you'll see some pictures of me. See, I was working in the South, and working in the South, especially during that time, you wore clothes that matched the need of the time. And I wore overalls, coveralls, jeans. Now, I could dress up for Sunday service,
right? But
Sunday service didn't come but once in a while. Most of the time, you were out in the field working for social justice.
Wow.
So Martin Luther King Jr. was a sharp dresser, but he also, when you look at him in my book, I got pictures of him on the side of the highway in Mississippi. You'll see he had on blue jeans and a straw hat and some old shoes that I bought for him in Tennessee.
Wow. Unbelievable. Incredible.
So working with King was the experience of my life. I don't regret it. I learned a lot. And I learned most of all to not be afraid to fight for social justice. No matter what,
right?
You fight for the right thing and you do the right thing and everything will turn out just fine.
Wow. Thank you so very much for coming on Strong Inspiration. You got any more comment? A question I didn't ask you, because I hate for that to miss something.
What I would say is this. I say to young people, Martin Luther King Jr. taught us in the Black community not to be afraid. Yeah. Fear was a factor that drove discrimination. Fear was a factor, fear of being locked up, put in jail, fear of being lynched, learning about fear from your parents and grandparents who grew up in the South. Like your parents probably grew up in the South.
Sure.
And my parents sure did.
Sure.
Our great grandparents grew up in the South. But King, that was the thing he taught us, not to be afraid. And I'm going to say my wind-up piece will be, do the right thing, and always be on the right side of justice, and you will be blessed in life.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Dr. Green, for taking time out of your schedule. Now, that book, how do people get copies of your book?
Link to Amazon, my son said.
Okay, it's on Amazon. Thank you so very much, Dr. Green, for spending time with us on this day. This is what we do at Strong Inspirations. The next guy that comes on was Richard Ashby. Richard Ashby met Dr. King when he was 9 years old. Tell us how you met Dr. King.
First of all, say greetings and thank you for having me again. And I really enjoyed your past guests and talking about that march. That march happened on April 4th, 1967, 1 year to the day before Dr. King was assassinated.
Wow.
Well, that's what he was talking about, Vietnam and the black man and the peasants in Vietnam were the only people that were suffering. That was April 4th, 1967, and they assassinated him exactly 1 year to the day.
Wow.
And that's why I love Brother Gil Scott-Heron when he said, just how blind can America be? The world is sitting on the edge of its seat, defeat on the horizon, very surprising. We all could see the plot and claim we could not.
Wow.
But that's for another,
Go,
that's
through that knowledge.
that's for another thing.
Through that knowledge.
But I met Dr. King once again. I'll tell you again. If you've seen the video, you can see it again. I met Dr. King when I was 9 years old. My aunt was from North Carolina, and she asked my mom if I could go with her to see Dr. King. We went down to Inwood, Long Island. She put me on the back of this car, told me to stand there and wait to see Dr. King. If I look to my left, I see First Baptist Church of Inwood, and I would see Dr. King. And I'm on the car and I'm standing there, and a young man comes by. He said, "You can't see Dr. King, and you're standing on the back of this car. Get down." We got off the car and we started crawling. And we saw, I think I remember seeing loafers, socks rolled down, which was called Bobby socks, long dresses. And back in those days, you asked the Brother Robert about dressing. Back in those days, we always wore white shirts and slacks everywhere we went. And I started crawling towards Dr. King on the ground, and I looked up, and Dr. King may have been 2 to 4 feet in front of me, and probably the dumbest thought in my mind I've ever had in my mind came to me, and it said, reach out and grab his coat pocket and grab it and rip it, and you'll have something from Dr. King. And he was marching like this. We shall overcome, because people had their arms under him protecting him. And I reached out and I grabbed his coat and I went to yank it, and he reached out and grabbed my hand and said, "Hi, what is your name?" And me, being a 9-year-old with a lisp and overbite, I said, "Dr. Martin Luther King, Dr. Martin Luther King." He said, "Yes, what is your name?" And I said, Richie Ashby. And he said, "Well, Richie, what are you doing? What do you want?" And the people was holding him up, said, "Dr. King, we gotta go." And he said, "No, I'm talking to Richie." And I was like, wow, this guy's talking to me. And Dr. King was like my idol. And I said, I'm thinking to myself, what do I want? She's asking me, what do I want? And I said, can you come to my house for dinner? And he said, well, no, I can't come. And they're pushing him and they're singing, "We shall overcome." And he asked me another question. Another question? He said, "What are you having for dinner?" What am I having for dinner? A young black kid out of Jamaica, Queens, New York. We're having neck bones and rice. What else is there to have? And he said, "Wow, it sounds delicious, but I can't make it this time. Maybe I'll come next time." And they're still pushing. And he said, "Dr. King, we gotta go." He says, "I'm talking to Richie." And he looked back around, and by the time he got back around to me, somebody reached over, grabbed me, pulled me to the curb from WNEW Fox TV, pulled me over and interviewed me, and everything, the rest is history.
Wow.
When I went to college, the dean found out that I had met Dr. King. I was one of 100 that graduated from, back in those days, they used to send black kids from the city to college, and they would send us to college and you would fail, but they would still get their money for enrolling you. And so they sent me with 99 other blacks to go to college, and I was the only black. I was the only one out of the 100 that graduated.
Wow.
And
so
the
now,
dean,
how tall did he appear to be to you? And he
was a giant.
That kind of
Kidding
thing.
me? Dr. Martin Luther King. Well, when I saw him, when I met Dr. King, he was at least 7'2". When I saw him, through my 9 years old eyes, he was 7'2". But in reality, he was maybe 5'8", 5'9". But as a young boy on his knees, grabbing some grown man's jacket, he was a giant.
And he took the time to talk to you.
Took the time to talk to me. And had, to me, he had the short little mustache, very clean, cut hair, short mustache, cut hair, beautiful brown skin, beautiful hands, very soft hands, and a nurturing voice, a voice that calmed you down. All heck was breaking loose. People was pushing and marching, and he's marching this way. No, he's marching this way because he was marching because they had stopped, but the crowd was coming towards him too. It was really an odd situation I never really thought about till just now.
Right.
Because I crawled up to him when people was marching. I don't know how that works.
Yeah, yeah.
I
Beautiful
don't know how that
story,
works.
brother. Man, thank
Okay.
you. Thank you so much for coming back on with us. Everybody, there's another video where he goes at length. But I just wanted to give a little bit more insight in honor of Dr. King's ceremonial day, because his birthday is actually on the 15th of January.
Yeah.
But as you know, we celebrated that Monday afterwards. And
This is what I want to say before I go. And then,
Yeah.
you know, you get so teary-eyed when you think about Dr. King and him being assassinated. And you think about Dr. King, you think about the dogs being turned on him, you think about the water hoses being turned on him, you're thinking about our students being spat on at the counter, spat on trying to go to school. And the brother just finished saying Dr. King didn't want us to be afraid. He just finished saying that his father always had fear because he saw someone hung. And so I'm just here today, today I'm just like Dr. King. I ain't scared of nobody. I'm not fearing any man. You know?
Beautiful. Beautiful, beautiful. Richard, well said. I'm coming back at you.
All right.
Everybody, have a happy, joyous, eat a good, healthy meal on Dr. King Day so you can live long and you can keep fighting that fight. Stay strong, stay safe, stay on your grind, everybody. Again, subscribe to Strong Inspirations, hit the like button, hit the notifications button today. Godspeed. Thanks.